class, and welcome to the next video on conservation and preservation of resources. You do need to take notes over everything again, and you do need to show me when I am back tomorrow your notes. So let's get started. Okay, so resources and conservation. Resources are part of the natural environment used to promote the welfare of people and other species. So a resource is anything that we may be using. For example, we have water, we have soil, minerals, our wildlife can be a resource, trees are resources, any of that is a resource. And conservation, though, is the sensible and careful management of our natural resources. So humans have practiced conservation of natural resources for thousands of years. As far back as 3,000 years ago, we know that the Phoenicians terraced hilly farmlands to prevent soil erosion. So we know that back that far, we were actually doing things to conserve what we already had. So the conservation methods can be both technological, like low flow showers today, or it can be behavioral, such as you taking a 5-minute shower. So there are all kinds of ways we can conserve, and doesn't need to take lots and lots of money though. Conservation efforts can be changing your own behaviors, changing your neighbors' behaviors, changing those around you behavior, and thus changing the whole world's behavior. So let's talk about preservation now. So when we conserve, we also want to preserve those resources that we are conserving. So the preservation involves the setting aside of undisturbed areas, maintaining them in a pristine state, and protecting them from human activities that might alter their natural state. So the decision to preserve places can be controversial. Resources in undisturbed places often have substantial economic value, while the value of nature in a preserved state is difficult to quantify. So for example, there's a big controversy about drilling in Alaska for oil. There's a lot of crude oil in Alaska, but it sits below natural, just natural resources and natural wildlife preservations. And so by doing this, we would no longer have those wildlife preservations, and we would destroy what we have there. So the question becomes, is drilling for oil in Alaska worth what we're destroying? And that is what a lot of politicians ask. So what our next section is going to be over is environmental history of around the 19th and 20th century. Now, this is going to have a lot of names and a lot of dates. And you're going to need to record these because these are going to pop up on quizzes and tests. So I need you to take careful notes on this, okay? Now, some of these we have heard before from your hero papers and presentations. So try and stick with me on this though. So the first establishments during the 1700s and most of the 1800s, many of the Americans had a frontier attitude. Now remember, we've talked about this before. The frontier attitude, if you do not remember, is a desire to conquer nature and put its resources to use in the most lucrative manner possible. So two characteristics of this frontier attitude from our European settlers and their descendants made us have this unsustainable resource use. And that was, we had a rapid population growth and a high per person consumption. So we started using all of these resources that we had, and we also started living longer, and we started having more people, and that really started to drive into the ground the resources that we did have. So it started to become a problem, but we really didn't see it immediately. So the first that we noticed is we needed to protect our forests. When we first got over here and settlements came, we had these great forests in the Northeast. Now these really aren't here anymore. They were cut down within the first couple generations of our European settlement because they needed shelter. They needed things that the forest could provide for them. And so the Europeans cut these down. And so we got rid of these really gorgeous old world forests. And then after the Civil War in the 1860s, loggers began deforesting the Midwest again. And this really became alarming because within 40 years, old growth forests the size of the entire continent of Europe had been removed. That was just within 40 years after the Civil War. So it was pretty quick. So then, after this happened, people started to think about, okay, what are we actually doing? So there came about some naturalists. And so during the 19th century, many U.S. naturalists began to voice concerns about conserving these natural resources because we were cutting down all these forests and using all these resources without thinking about the repercussions. And so the first person who he didn't really speak out, but he kind of painted. And in his paintings, he established what is it going to be like without these. So John James Audubon, who did help with the Audubon Society, painted lifelike portraits of birds and other animals in their natural surroundings. And the thought was, if we get rid of these natural surroundings, we may not have these animals anymore. The next person was Henry David Thoreau. He was a prominent U.S. writer who lived on the shore of Walden Pond, where he observed nature and contemplated how people would simplify their lives to live in harmony with the natural world. And he wrote a book, Walden, about his life at Walden Pond. But these weren't the only ones. There were more people who spoke out about what was going on. And George Perkins Marsh, who was a farmer, a linguist, and a diplomat at various times in his life, who is most remembered for his book, Man and Nature, provided one of the first discussions of humans as agents of environmental change. He basically told us that we're the reason the world around us is changing. And due to all of these naturalists, in 1875, a group of Americans formed the American Forestry Association, which then, in 1891, the Forest Reserve Act gave the U.S. President the authority to establish forest reserves on public land. So basically, no one could come in and chop down that forest. It was a federal land and it was protected. So Presidents Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt used this to put 17.4 million hectares out of the reach of loggers. So these are all protected forests. No one can touch it. No one can go in and chop down these trees now because of this act. So Roosevelt appointed Gifford Pinchot the first head of the Forest Service. Both were utilitarian conservationists who viewed the forest in terms of their usefulness to people, such as providing jobs and renewable resources. And they could see that the world around them was changing the more they got rid of these forests. So they needed to conserve this natural resource that we had. And they needed to provide a reason to do this, and these jobs became this reason. So the utilitarian conservationist, a person who values natural resources, is a person who values natural resources because of their usefulness to humans, but uses them sensibly and carefully. Anyone in this room can be a utilitarian conservationist. It's very easy to be a utilitarian conservationist because you recognize the usefulness to you, to your family, to everyone in the world around you, and you recognize how that will help each and every other person, and so you use it sensibly. This does not mean you do not use certain things. This does not mean you go off the deep end. It just means you use it very, very sensibly. So establishing national parks and monuments. The first national park was established in 1872 after Montana explorers reported on the beauty and the canyon and the falls of the Yellowstone River. So right after that, we established Yellowstone National Park. And some of you may have been to Yellowstone National Park and seen just exactly how beautiful this is. But it's changed since then because of things we've done to our earth. So then in 1890, the Yosemite National Park Bill established Yosemite and the Sequoia National Parks in California. This was in response to naturalist John Muir. Now, Muir was a biocentric preservationist who founded the Sierra Club, which was a national conservation organization, and the Sierra Club still exists today. There are still meetings of the Sierra Club where people discuss how to conserve our natural resources that we still have left. So the biocentric preservation is a person who believes in protecting nature from human interference because of all life forms deserve respect and consideration. So we're not just thinking solely of ourselves as humans, but we're thinking of all the nature around us and all the life around us, and they deserve just as much of the earth as we do. And so because of that biocentric preservation, John Muir helped establish these national parks. So these are some pictures of John Muir, and he actually worked he helped Theodore Roosevelt to establish these national parks. So more on the national parks and monuments. In 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which authorized the president to set aside sites that had scientific, historic, or prehistoric importance. Today, there are 58 national parks and 74 national monuments. Now, this is just national parks and monuments. This is not anything to do with the state parks. So there are state parks and national parks. We're only talking national parks, and there are only 58 national parks. So in 1916, Congress created the National Park Service to manage these national parks and created the rangers for that and the monuments so the public could enjoy the national parks. So conservation in the mid-20th century, so let's fast forward a little bit. And during the Great Depression, the federal government financed the conservation projects to provide jobs for the unemployed. Now, if you recall from your history class, there was a lot of issues with employment during and right after the Great Depression. And FDR basically established the Civilian Conservation Corps. And basically they went around and made trees, they made paths, roads, all kinds of things within the national parks. So if you go hiking in a national park, the Civilian Conservation Corps made that path for you to hike on. And this was so that they could create jobs. During the Dust Bowl, President Roosevelt formed the Soil Conservation Service in 1935. So we use conservation efforts to our economic benefit. Now, there are several other people from the mid-20th century that helped us with our conservation efforts. Aldo Leopold, one of the noted conservationists, was a wildlife biologist and environmental visionary. He greatly influenced the conservation movement of the mid to late 20th century, and he wrote about humanity's relationship with nature and the need to conserve a wilderness area in a Sand County Almanac. The Sand County Almanac is actually one of the go-to books for environmentalism, and it is really about what do we need to do with the environment. And many college students studying this area, it's a required reading for them in one of their courses. So it's still prevalent today. The next person who we've talked about a little bit in